The darkness was absolute, a thick, velvet substance that filled the small room. It was the deep, silent hour just before the world remembered itself. No bird called, no insect chirped. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic whisper of breath, one set steady and aged, the other light and untroubled. On a thin rush mat, Yuki lay awake. She felt the coarse texture of her hemp sleeping robe against her skin, a familiar roughness. Beside her, her grandson Genji slept, his small back rising and falling in a tranquil tide. She listened to him, a ritual more comforting than any prayer. The distant sharp cry of a fox pierced the stillness, a lone needle of sound that faded into nothing. Then, a change. Not a sound, but a softening. The utter black beyond the wooden lattice window began to dilute to a deep, cool gray. It was the first light, seeping into the world like water into cloth. It revealed the shapes of the room, the soot-blackened beams of the low ceiling, the shadow of a single shelf holding a clay water jar, the faint outline of the shoji screen leading to the main room. Yuki moved. Her joints protested with a series of small, dry cracks, knee, shoulder, the base of her spine, a familiar morning chorus. She pushed aside her thin cotton blanket and sat up, the movement slow and deliberate. The packed earth floor was cool beneath her feet. She paused, letting her body adjust to being upright, her eyes tracing the lines of the ceiling she had known for 60 years. The gray light strengthened, turning the window from a shape of pure dark to a grid of ash-colored lines. She could see the dust motes beginning to stir in the nascent air. Genji sighed in his sleep, a soft, milky sound, and turned over, his small hand flopping onto the space where she had lain. Rising fully, Yuki shuffled to the window. She placed a hand on the cool wood of the lattice and looked out. Their hut stood at the village's edge, where the cultivated land gave way to the wild embrace of the mountain. The world outside was a study in monochrome. The thatched roofs of neighboring homes were dark humps against the lighter gray of the packed earth paths. Beyond, the forest was a solid wall of shadow, but above the tree line the sky was bleeding. A narrow band of palest lavender and faintest gold etched the eastern ridge, silhouetting the supreme, silent form of the sacred mountain. It dominated the horizon, a deeper cut of darkness against the brightening sky, its peak still holding the night in its cradle. A thin tendril of mist, white as a ghost, clung to its middle slopes. A rooster crowed far down the lane. The sound was brittle in the vast quiet, but it was a trigger. Another answered, closer. In the forest, a single bird ventured a tentative chirp, then another. The world was waking. Yuki turned from the window. Her morning duties awaited, a sequence as fixed as the path of the sun. She knelt beside Genji for a moment, watching the dawn light begin to touch his cheek. He would sleep a little longer. She smoothed a strand of black hair from his forehead, her fingers gnarled and strong, gentle in their motion. She moved into the main room, a space of simple function. A sunken, irori hearth sat in the center, its ashes cold and gray from the previous night. A low wooden table, its surface worn smooth by generations of use, stood to one side. She went first to the water jar, dipping a small wooden ladle and drinking a few mouthfuls. The water was cold from the night, clean and sharp, washing the taste of sleep away. Next, she attended to the hearth. Kneeling, she used a pair of bamboo tongs to clear the old ash into a ceramic pot, leaving a clean, blackened circle. She arranged a few pieces of charred wood from the edge, then reached for the kindling dry cedar twigs snapped the day before. Her movements were economical, practiced. She struck a flint against a piece of iron. The click click spark, a bright, tiny violence in the quiet room. A spark caught on a tuft of dried moss. She cupped it gently, blowing until a small, eager flame emerged. She fed it twigs, then a small split log. The fire grew, its light suddenly warm and alive, painting dancing shadows on the walls and beating back the residual gloom. The crackle of the fire was the new heartbeat of the home. Yuki placed an iron pot over the flames, pouring in water from a larger storage vessel. From a woven-lidded basket she scooped a measure of pale-hulled millet grains and added them to the water. This would be their awa gayu, the morning gruel. The routine was a meditation. The feel of the grains, the sound of the water beginning to simmer, the growing scent of wood smoke and impending meal. As the pot began to steam, she heard the rustle of bedding from the other room. A small face, puffy with sleep, appeared around the edge of the shoji. Genji blinked at the firelight, his eyes wide and dark. "Good morning, grandmother," he murmured, his voice still thick with dreams. Yuki smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening. "The morning is good," she thought. "The mountain is watching. Come, the day begins." Yuki re-entered the dwelling's single room, the scent of night-cooled earth and aged wood greeting her. The fire in the aurori hearth had subsided to a bed of glowing embers buried in a soft mound of white ash. She knelt before it, her movements a slow ceremony. Using the bamboo tongs, she carefully parted the ash, revealing the heart of the heat, a cluster of embers pulsing like tiny, drowsy suns. She bent low, her lined face illuminated by the orange glow, and blew a steady, practiced stream of air across them. A wisp of smoke curled upward. She blew again, softer this time, coaxing rather than commanding. A single ember brightened, then another. She selected a handful of the finest cedar kindling, shavings as dry as old bone, and nestled them into the cradle of heat. Leaning close once more, she breathed life into the nest. A tiny flame blew at its core, licked at a shaving, caught, and grew. The sound of crackling kindling filled the room, a rapid, hungry whisper that spoke of warmth and work to come. Satisfied, she placed a few larger sticks in a careful pyramid over the fledgling fire. The flames climbed, embracing the wood, their light pushing the remaining shadows into the corners. She filled the small iron pot from the water jar and set it at the edge of the flames where it would heat gradually. As the water began its slow journey toward a simmer, she turned to her day's craft. Beside her sleeping mat lay a bundled pile of hemp fibers, prepared days before through the long process of retting and beating. She gathered the coarse, pale strands into her lap. The morning light, now strengthening to a clear gray, fell across her hands as she began to sort. Her fingers, though stiff at the knuckles, knew their purpose. They worked through the fibers with a methodical rhythm, feeling for imperfections, a stubborn knot of bast, a section weakened by uneven retting. Each troublesome piece was set aside for later attention. In her mind, she recited the silent litany of the process, the stalks soaked in the stream's slow current to rot the pith, the beaten fibers drying in the sun, the twisting into thread that would come later. This sorting was the quiet prelude, a task of patience and tactile judgment. The water in the pot began to sing, a low hiss that built into a gentle rumble. Steam rose, carrying with it the pure scent of heating iron and well water. Yuki added a pinch of salt from a small clay cell, then a careful measure of millet from a woven basket. The grains hissed as they hit the water, and she stirred once with a long wooden spoon. The gruel would need time. A soft rustle came from the other side of the room. Genji stirred on his futon. Yuki watched from the corner of her eye as the small mound of blankets shifted. A hand emerged, then a head of sleep-tousled black hair. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the fire-lit world. For a moment he simply lay there, cocooned in the residual warmth of his sleep, watching the dancing flames reflected in the dark beams above. His waking was a slow unfurling, devoid of urgency. He yawned, a small soundless stretch of his jaw, and pushed the blankets down to his waist. The morning chill touched his skin, and he shivered once, a quick, full-body tremor before sitting up. He rubbed his eyes with his fists, then looked across the room to where his grandmother worked, her profile etched against the growing light from the window. The crackle of the fire and the soft, rhythmic sound of her hands working through the hemp were the familiar music of his mornings. "Is it time?" he asked, his voice still soft with sleep. "It is always time," Yuki replied without looking up, a faint smile touching her lips. "The water is hot for washing." Genji nodded, pushing himself fully upright. He padded across the cool earth floor to the water jar where a small wooden basin waited. He poured water from the ladle, the splash loud in the quiet room, and splashed his face. He gasped at the cold, the shock finishing the work of waking. He dried his face on a piece of rough linen, his skin glowing and awake. He came to sit near the hearth, close enough to feel its warmth on his legs. He watched Yuki's hands, the way the pale fibers flowed through her fingers like water. The smell of the cooking millet gruel began to permeate the air, a plain, earthy scent that promised sustenance. Outside, the world had fully transitioned from night to day. The gray light was now a clear, cool white, illuminating the dust in the air and the simple, worn surfaces of their home. The sacred mountain, visible through the lattice window, had shed its shroud of shadow and stood revealed in the dawn, a steadfast, green-black presence against a brightening sky. The village was awakening around them. They heard the distant thud of an axe, old Haru beginning his work in the woods. A woman's voice called a greeting to a neighbor. The day's cycle, into which their own small rituals were seamlessly woven, had begun. The millet gruel was consumed in silence, a simple, warming sustenance. After the wooden bowls were washed and set to dry, Yuki turned to the heart of her mourning. She moved to the far corner of the main room, where her loom stood anchored to a sturdy roof beam and the packed earth floor. It was a sturdy, ancient device, its dark wood polished to a deep, smoky sheen by generations of hands, her mother's, her grandmother's, her own. It was not merely a tool, it was a testament, a silent partner in the quiet drama of creation. She settled onto the low, woven stool before it. The warp threads stretched taut on the frame were a grid of undied hemp, the color of pale cream. She ran her fingers across them, feeling their texture, a slight, resilient roughness, the individual fibers twisted into a strong, humble cord. They hummed faintly under her touch. A low, resonant note felt more in the bone than heard. From a basket at her side, she retrieved the shuttle, a smooth length of polished cedar hollowed to hold the weft thread. This thread was dyed with madder root, a soft, earthy red the color of dried clay or a winter sunset. She loaded the shuttle with care, the red thread a vivid promise against the neutral warp. Then she began, her foot pressed a worn wooden pedal. The harnesses lifted with a soft clack, separating a precise set of warp threads, creating a temporary space called the shed. Her right hand, holding the shuttle, darted through this open channel with a swift, fluid motion, a swish thread. She released the pedal. The harnesses dropped with another clack, locking the new red thread into place. Then, with both hands, she pulled the beater, a heavy comb-like bar, firmly toward her. Thump. The sound was solid, final, a percussive punctuation that settled the thread snugly against its predecessors. Clack, swish, thread, clack, thump. The rhythm was born. It filled the small room, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to sync with her own pulse. Clack, swish, thread, clack, thump. Each cycle was a breath. Each thump was a step forward, an irrevocable advance of the fabric on the beam. Her body became an extension of the machine, the press of her foot, the flick of her wrist, the pull of her arms. Her eyes, sharp despite their years, watched the growing cloth, for now the red squares began to emerge, pixel by pixel, line by line. They were not perfectly sharp. The hand-spun thread had minute variations in thickness, giving the pattern a subtle, living texture. It was a beauty born of imperfection and patience. The morning light, now a clear gold, streamed through the lattice window and fell across the growing fabric. It illuminated the dust motes stirred by the beater's motion, making them dance like tiny spirits around her work. The scent in the room was a quiet blend, the clean, dry smell of the hemp threads, the faint, mineral scent of the madder dye, the underlying aroma of wood smoke and tatami from the night before. Clack, swish, thread, clack, thump. Outside, the village's morning symphony played on the distant thud of Haru's axe, the cluck of chickens, a child's laugh. But in Yuki's corner, the world contracted to the space between the harnesses. The rhythmic sounds of her loom were her contribution to the chorus, a steady, productive thread in the village's daily weave. The sacred mountain, visible through the window over the loom's frame, stood as a silent witness to this incremental creation, as it had for centuries. Genji played quietly nearby, assembling small sticks into shapes on the floor, but his eyes often drifted to his grandmother. He watched the hypnotic dance of her hands and feet, the slow, miraculous emergence of pattern from chaos. He knew this rhythm was the sound of warmth, of clothing, of continuity. The clack, clack, thump was the sound of home. Yuki's face was a mask of serene concentration. There was no strain, only a deep, flowing engagement. In the repetitive motion, her thoughts stilled. She was not thinking of the past or the future, only of the present thread, the present pass, the present thump. In this focused silence, she was not an old woman in a small hut. She was a creator, a weaver of worlds, binding the threads of time itself into something tangible and strong. The fabric grew, one resonant thump at a time, a testament to a quiet morning, a steady hand, and the enduring woven heart of life. The worn path into the pine forest was a familiar seam in the earth, stitched between the village's ordered fields and the wildness of the mountain. Genji walked it with the easy, ground-eating stride of youth, a large, loosely woven bamboo basket secured on his back by straps of braided vine. The air changed as he left the open sunlight. It grew cooler, damper, and carried a weight of silence that was not empty but full. Under the canopy, the world was painted in shades of green and gold. The high sun filtered through layers of needled boughs, casting a dappled, shifting light that pooled on the forest floor. The path itself was soft and spongy, a thick carpet of fallen pine needles that muted his footsteps to a whisper. With each step, a faint, dry citrus resin scent rose from the crushed needles, mingling with the deeper, cooler smell of damp earth and decaying wood. His first task lay ahead, where the path intersected a slender stream. The water was a clear, cold ribbon, chattering over a bed of moss-slick stones and polished gravel. In a quiet eddy, partially shaded by the arching roots of an ancient pine, He had placed 3 simple fish traps the previous evening, cylinders of woven bamboo with clever, inward-pointing funnels. Genji knelt on the stream's bank, the dampness immediately seeping through the knee of his trousers. He reached into the chill water, his fingers numbing quickly, and carefully lifted the first trap. It emerged dripping, heavier than it had gone in. Through the latticework he saw a flash of silver and a flicker of muted green. He upended the trap over his basket. 2 small trout, each the length of his hand from wrist to fingertip, slid out with a wet slap onto the woven bamboo. They gasped, their gills flaring, scales gleaming like wet coins in the speckled light. He admired them for a moment, the perfect streamlined shape, the subtle patterning before covering them with a layer of broad, damp fern fronds to keep them cool. The other 2 traps were empty save for a single disgruntled crayfish, which he released back into the stream. He reset them all with methodical care, securing them with stones against the current, baiting the interior with a crumbled piece of dried insect cake. The work was quiet, his movements precise, his breathing the only human sound alongside the water's endless gossip. With the basket now bearing its first bounty, he turned his attention to the forest's green offering. His eyes, sharpened by practice, scanned the shaded undergrowth. He sought the distinctive coiled fiddleheads of the bracken fern, a prized spring vegetable. He found a patch growing in a shaft of sunlight near a rotting log. The young fronds curled tight like sleeping serpents, their furled tips a vibrant, pale green. Using a short, sharp knife of forged iron, he cut them cleanly at the base, collecting a dozen into a neat bundle which he placed beside the fish. He moved deeper, his senses fully engaged. The basket on his back became a repository of the mountain's quiet generosity. He added a clutch of hen-of-the-woods mushrooms, their layered gray-brown caps growing in a ruffled cascade from the base of an oak. He gathered young, tender shoots of wild udo, their celery-like stalks snapping with a crisp, juicy sound. His fingers brushed over velvety moss and rough bark, his ears attuned to the forest's sounds, the rustle of a lizard in the leaf litter, the distant drilling of a woodpecker, the sigh of the wind moving through the high pine needles like a slow exhalation. Always through occasional breaks in the foliage, the sacred mountain was there. It was no longer the mist-shrouded silhouette of dawn, but a solid, detailed presence, its slopes a tapestry of deep evergreen and lighter deciduous growth, its rocky outcrops catching the midday sun. It was not a backdrop, but a participant, the source of this stream, this soil, this abundant breathing life that filled his basket. The basket grew heavier, a satisfying weight. The trout, the ferns, the mushrooms, the shoots, each item was a small negotiation with the forest, taken with respect and the understanding of need. He paused by the stream once more to drink, cupping the icy water in his hands, the taste clean and mineral sharp. As he rose, a shaft of sunlight fell directly upon him, warm on his shoulders, highlighting the dust of pine pollen and forest loam on his clothes. He adjusted the basket straps and turned back toward the village, the path now leading downhill. The mountain at his back, its bounty carried gently in his care. The basket was a satisfying weight, a cradle of cool, damp greens and the faint, clean scent of fish. Genji continued his ascent, leaving the chattering stream behind. The path grew steeper, the pine giving way to broader stands of cedar and oak. Here the light was different, greener, more subdued, falling in heavy, silent shafts through the dense canopy. The air smelled of damp stone and rich, rotting leaves. His purpose now was fuel. His eyes scanned the ground, seeking not the vibrant green of food, but the gray and brown of fallen wood. He found a good cache beneath a massive, lightning-scarred cedar, branches of dry oak, their bark rough and furrowed, and slender poles of cedar, lighter and resinous. He laid his basket carefully on a bed of moss and set to work. Using a short hatchet from his belt, he trimmed the branches of twigs and smaller offshoots, the blade biting into the dry wood, with a series of crisp thwacks that echoed briefly in the forest stillness. The sound was sharp and purposeful, a human punctuation in the natural quiet. He gathered the trimmed lengths, selecting only what was truly dead and dry, and began to arrange them into a neat, tight bundle. He used lengths of supple wild vine, cutting them with his knife and wrapping them with practiced tension around the wood, pulling the bundle into a manageable rectangular faggot. He secured the final knot, then heaved the bundle onto his shoulders, settling it across his back atop the basket. The rough bark pressed through his thin hemp shirt, a familiar scratchy sensation that spoke of useful labor and the coming warmth of a hearth. His load complete, he did not immediately turn for home. A small detour, a ritual of respect, called to him. He left the main path, following a nearly invisible deer trail that wound around a mossy outcrop. The air grew even quieter, the dense foliage muffling all sound. Ahead, beneath the vast, sheltering canopy of an ancient camphor tree, stood the shrine. It was a hokora, a simple wayside sanctuary no larger than a child's playhouse. Its structure was plain, weathered wood, but its heart was a smooth, dark stone, naturally upright and draped with a faded, sacred rope of woven rice straw. The stone was old, older than the village, a silent witness rooted deep in the mountain's flesh. The camphor tree above it was a giant, its trunk massive and gnarled, its leaves releasing a clean, medicinal scent into the cool, still air. Genji approached slowly. He set his burdens down at the edge of the clearing. From his basket he selected the 3 freshest, most perfectly coiled fern fiddleheads. He stepped forward on the carpet of soft moss, knelt before the stone, and placed the green offerings gently at its base. The vibrant fronds looked like a gift from the living forest to the ancient stone. He straightened, brought his hands together in front of his chest, and clapped twice, soft, clear sounds that seemed to hang in the sacred quiet. He bowed deeply from the waist, holding the position for a long moment, his eyes on the moss between his feet. No words were spoken. Words felt unnecessary here. The offering, the clap, the bow, these were the language. It was a transaction of gratitude, an acknowledgement of the mountain's spirit, the kami of this place, for the bounty he carried and the safety of his path. It was a routine of quiet respect, performed with the unthinking sincerity of habit woven into belief. Rising, he retrieved his basket and faggot. The atmosphere of the clearing seemed to cling to him for a few steps, a residue of stillness before the ordinary sounds of the forest. A bird's call, the rustle of leaves filtered back in. The return journey was a descent, the path now familiar in reverse. The afternoon light was deepening, the sun's angle lower, painting the western sides of the tree trunks in warm gold and stretching long, distorted shadows across the forest floor. The green gloom of the deep woods began to lighten as he neared the village edge. He passed the terraced rice fields, where the flooded paddies reflected the sky in narrow, shimmering strips of pale blue and gold. The air grew warmer, carrying now the distant, rhythmic thump of a loom from a nearby home and the faint, earthy scent of cooking from morning fires not yet fully extinguished. He could see his grandmother's hut ahead, the thatch glowing in the late afternoon sun. The sacred mountain, now at his back, was beginning to gather the evening to itself, its eastern face falling into a deep, serene blue shadow. Genji adjusted the bight of the vine straps on his shoulders, feeling the full, honest weight of the mountain's bounty, the food for their pot, the wood for their fire, and walked the final steps home. The story returns to Yuki, now in the full, still heat of the afternoon. She has moved outside to work in the shade of the eaves, spinning hemp thread onto a wooden spittle. The description details the precise, repetitive motion, the twist of the fibers between thumb and forefinger, the growing weight of the spindle. Sweat beads on her temple. The village is somnolent. The cicada's drone is at its peak, a blanket of sound. A butterfly flutters past. Yuki observes Haru, the young woman from earlier, returning from the woods with a bundle of medicinal herbs, her face serene. The heat was a physical presence, a heavy, silent blanket that had settled over the village in the hours after noon. Inside the hut, the air had grown still and warm, carrying the scent of sun-baked tatami and old wood. Seeking relief, Yuki had moved her work to the narrow strip of deep shadow cast by the steeply pitched thatch roof. She sat on a worn wooden plank placed directly on the dry earth, her back against a cool plaster wall. Before her, in a shallow basket, lay a cloud of prepared hemp fibers, pale and soft as old linen. In her lap rested a simple drop spindle, a smooth, tapered length of dark wood, its whorl a carved disc at one end. Her hands began their work with a rhythm as old as the mountain. She pinched a few fibers from the mass, rolling them between the calloused pad of her thumb and forefinger into a tentative, fuzzy connection. With a deft flick of her wrist, she set the spindle spinning, a humming top of dark wood. Gravity pulled it downward, and as it fell, it drew the fibers from her fingers, twisting them into a strong, continuous thread. Her left hand fed the supply. Her right controlled the tension, the twist traveling up the nascent thread like a living thing. The motion was hypnotic. Pinch, draw, spin, guide. The spindle orbited slowly at the end of its growing thread, a pendulum marking the passage of the quiet hour. Its weight increased incrementally, a satisfying accumulation of purpose. A bead of sweat formed at her temple, traced a slow path down the side of her face, and soaked into the collar of her indigo-dyed robe. She did not wipe it away. The heat was part of the moment, as was the shade, as was the work. The village around her lay in a state of suspended animation. No one moved along the central path. The blacksmith's hammer was silent. The only sound, immense and all-enveloping, was the drone of the cicadas. It was a high, metallic shriek that vibrated in the air and the bones, a blanket of sound so constant it became the new silence. Beneath it, like a faint heartbeat, was the occasional thump from a nearby home where someone else worked at a loom. A cabbage-white butterfly, its wings a fragile white, fluttered erratically across the sun-drenched path, a spot of animate brightness against the bleached earth. It danced on the hot air currents before disappearing behind a fence. Yuki's gaze lifted from her spinning. Down the lane, a figure emerged from the green gloom of the forest path. It was the young woman Haru, returning from her morning in the woods. She moved with a slow, fluid grace, unhurried by the heat. A gathering basket was hooked over one arm, filled not with firewood, but with the feathery tops of wild herbs and the broad leaves of useful plants. Her face, glimpsed in profile as she passed, was serene, damp with a healthy sweat, and bore the quiet, focused contentment of one who has been in deep communion with the green world. She did not look toward Yuki. Her attention turned inward, and she disappeared into the shade of her own home. Yuki watched her go, then looked down at her own hands, at the strong, even thread spiraling onto the spindle. Her rhythm never faltered. The cicadas screamed. The heat shimmered over the empty path. In the deep shade of the eaves, in the patient twist of fiber into thread, the afternoon held its breath, suspended in the golden, drowsy apex of the day. As the sun sank behind the western ridge, the light turned molten and long. It gilded the thatched roofs and stretched the shadows of the trees into slender, dark fingers that pointed eastward toward the now purple silhouette of the sacred mountain. The intense, buzzing heat of the afternoon dissipated, replaced by a gentle, enveloping warmth that carried the first cool breath of evening from the forest. From the fields and the woods, the villagers returned. Their figures moved along the paths, baskets and tools in hand, their footsteps soft on the packed earth. The sounds of the day's end were gentle and domestic, the low murmur of greetings, the creak of a gate, the clatter of a hoe being leaned against a wall. The air, which had smelled of dry dust and hot greenery, began to shift. The first tendrils of cooking smoke, fragrant with pine and simmering broth, spiraled up from hearths to join the deepening twilight. Inside their hut, Yuki and Genji prepared their evening meal in the fading light. The Aurori hearth was the heart of the room, its flames casting a warm, dancing glow that pushed back the gathering dusk. Over the fire, a small iron pot bubbled gently. In it simmered the trout Genji had caught, now flaked into tender pieces, along with the wild udo shoots and bracken ferns, all seasoned with a pinch of precious salt and a few dried shiso leaves for fragrance. The smell was simple and profound, the clean essence of the mountain's water and soil, transformed by fire into nourishment. They sat on woven mats at the low table. Yuki ladled the stew into 2 wooden bowls, the steam rising in wisps that caught the firelight. They ate in a comfortable silence, broken only by the soft sounds of consumption, the gentle click of chopsticks against lacquered wood, the quiet sip of broth. The flavors were earthy and direct, the mild sweetness of the fern, the delicate flakiness of the fish, the subtle peppery note of the shiso. It was food that tasted of the day's labor and the specific bounty of their place in the world. Genji ate with the focused appetite of a growing boy, while Yuki savored each bite, her movements slow and deliberate. After eating, Genji gathered the bowls. He took them outside to the large water cistern carved from a single block of stone near the door. Using fine sand from a small bucket and a handful of tough, fibrous sedge grass, he scoured the wooden surfaces clean, the gritty sound a quiet rasp in the evening stillness. He rinsed them with a dipper of cold water, the droplets sparkling briefly in the last of the light, and set them on a bamboo rack to dry. As he worked, Yuki lit the mosquito smudge. She took a bundle of green herbs, mugwort and chrysanthemum leaves gathered from the hillside, bound tightly with a strand of rice straw. Holding it to the hearth's embers, she let it catch, then blew out the flame, leaving it to smolder. A thick, aromatic smoke, pungent and slightly sweet, began to coil into the air. She placed the smudge in a ceramic dish and set it near the open doorway. The smoke drifted out into the twilight, creating a hazy, fragrant barrier against the evening's insects. Their tasks complete, they moved outside to sit on the worn wooden step before their door. The world was settling into layers of soft noise and deepening color. In the stream below, frogs began their evening chorus, a rhythmic bubbling chirrup that seemed to cool the air. Bats dipped and swooped in the silvery sky above the fields, silent but for the faint whisper of their wings. Yuki and Genji sat side by side, not speaking, simply being in the transition. The aromatic smoke from the smudge curled around them. They watched the last embers of the sunset fade from apricot to ash gray behind the mountain's ridge. One by one, stars pricked through the vast, darkening dome overhead. From a nearby home, they heard the faint, happy chatter of a family gathered for their meal, a muffled sound of belonging. Inside, the fire in the Aurori had burned down to a bed of glowing coals, a tiny, warm sun contained in a circle of ash. Its light flickered weakly on the walls, enough to see the shapes of their few possessions, The silent loom, the water jar, the sleeping mats waiting in the other room. The sacred mountain was now a solid black cutout against a starry sky, its presence a comforting, familiar void. The evening bell from the village shrine rang out, a single, clear, bronze note that hung in the cool air before dissolving into the night. It was a signal, a gentle punctuation marking the end of the day's chapter. Genji leaned his head lightly against his grandmother's shoulder. She placed a hand on his hair, her touch dry and warm. The day, with its rhythm of tasks and quiet purpose, was complete. All that remained was the gentle, patient wait for sleep, cradled by the sounds of the night and the deep, enduring repose of the land. The final lamp in the village had been extinguished. The world was given over to the moon and the stars inside the hut. The only light was the cold, silver-blue stream pouring through the wooden lattice of the window. It fell in a precise geometric grid upon the packed earth floor, painting bars of luminous pallor across the dark, silent loom and the edge of the sleeping mats. The hearth was a circle of absolute darkness, the ashes within a long cold. Yuki lay on her thin futon, the coarse hemp of her sleeping robe a familiar texture against her skin. She was not asleep. Her body was still, but her senses were open, drinking in the intimate sounds of the house at rest. A timber in the roof, cooling from the day's residual warmth, gave a soft, deep creak, a sound like a settling sigh. From within the thick thatch overhead came a faint, dry rustle, a mouse or perhaps a gecko moving through its own miniature world. The sound was not an intrusion, but a part of the home's nocturnal breath. Beside her, Genji slept deeply. She listened to the steady, slow rhythm of his breathing, an inhalation and exhalation as reliable as the tide. It was a sound that anchored her to the present, to this quiet, dark room, more firmly than any prayer or thought could. Outside, the night was not silent, but full. The cicada's furious daytime drone had ceased, replaced by a more intricate, endless chorus. Crickets chirred from the foundation stones, a metallic stitching of sound. From the damp edges of the rice paddies and the stream bank came the resonant, fluting calls of frogs, overlapping in a complex, liquid conversation. Further away in the deep forest, an owl uttered a single low question, woo, and received no answer but the wind. Yuki's gaze traced the path of the moonlight on the floor. It illuminated motes of dust, suspended like frozen stars in the still air. Her mind, which had been occupied all day with the counts of the weave, the selection of herbs, the sequence of tasks, was now empty. It was not a blank emptiness, but a clear, still pool. The worries of mortality, the memories of years long past, the simple plans for tomorrow, all had receded, leaving only a profound awareness of the moment. She felt the cool night air on her face, smelled the faint, lingering scent of the evening's mosquito smudge, a ghost of mugwort and chrysanthemum mingled with the eternal clean smell of the tatami and the distant, damp earth. She heard the village itself sleeping, the faint, almost imperceptible sigh of 100 thatched roofs, the whisper of the great cedar in the shrine grove stirring in a night breeze. Her thoughts, when they came, were not thoughts at all, but sensations. The solid, reassuring presence of the mountain outside, now a deeper black against the starry sky. The weight of the worn cotton blanket over her legs. The sound of Genji's breath. The knowledge that the loom held a half-finished length of cloth. The spindle held a new cop of thread. The basket by the door held a few remaining wild mushrooms for tomorrow's broth. It was a completeness, a cycle brought to a point of perfect, temporary rest. A cloud, thin as a veil, drifted across the face of the moon. The grid of silver light on the floor softened, dimmed, then brightened again as the cloud passed. The change was slow and graceful, a silent ballet in the sky witnessed only by the sleepless and the stars. Yuki's eyelids grew heavy. The chorus of insects began to soften at the edges of her hearing, blending into a single, soothing hum. The cool air seemed to settle over her like a second blanket. The last conscious sensation was the deep, quiet certainty of place, of being here, in this house, on this floor, under this roof, with her grandson breathing beside her in the long, deep night of the 11th century. The mountain watched. The stream murmured. The world turned slowly towards another dawn. Her own breathing deepened, synchronizing with Genji's. The line between listening and dreaming dissolved. She slept, and the house slept with her, cradled in the deep breathing night. And so, the day in the year 10,026 comes to its quiet close. The mountain remains, silent and steadfast, as it has for 1,000 years. The tasks of the day are finished. The loom is still. The fire is cold. There is nothing left to be done, but to rest. Like Yuki and Genji, may you find comfort in the stillness of the night. May your breath be as steady as the mountain stream, and your sleep as deep as the ancient forest. Good night.